When we're discussing species at risk and we're trying to help species at risk, we need to understand that some species are more vulnerable than other species. Some species are more likely to go extinct. Some species need our help, and others, they're going to be fine. This Galapagos tortoise is an example of a vulnerable species, and I will explain why. Why do species go extinct? They're all facing the same stresses, the same pressures, they're all competing in the same habitats. What makes these black-footed ferrets more likely to go extinct than their other weasel cousins? Some species are vulnerable. They have certain traits that make it easier for them to go extinct. In the case of this black-footed ferret, they lived in a habitat that became drastically changed and removed and destroyed. One of the first things that make species vulnerable are long maturation times. Blue whales don't become sexually mature until they're about 10 years old. And then they're mammals and they have a 1-year long gestation rate. So a blue whale, after being born, cannot birth another blue whale for 11 or 12 years. This means that a species like humans can kill them all, hunt them to extinction, before they have time to repopulate. This makes a species vulnerable. Even if there's not humans, if there's something happening, having that long maturation time makes it longer for them to repopulate after an event that hurts their population. Humans have just sped this up because we kill things at fast rates. This is often paired with a low reproductive rate. Blue whales also have a very low reproductive rate, but there are species that have shorter maturation times that also have low reproductive rates, like the panda. Pandas have only produce young every few years, and this is for many reasons. When they do produce young, it's only one cub at a time. They're mammals again, so they have a gestation period that is quite long, and they have a very short estrus period. This is really common in mammals that their viable time of year, their estrus period, heat is what we call it in cats, is very short. Most mammals only mate during one season. And they do this because they want to have their young at an opportune time so that there's a lot of food available. So bears, for example, always have their cubs in the winter while they're hibernating so that when they wake up in the spring and there's lots of food, the cubs are ready. They've been drinking mom's milk for a few months and they're ready to start foraging. And this is really common with mammals to have these very specific windows. Pandas have one of the shortest. So it makes it very difficult. You can't just have two pandas come together and mate at any point. It needs to be at the right time in the right place. And then even if there is a successful mating, then it's going to take a long time to have a cub and there's only going to be one at a time. This is a low reproductive rate. Many birds of prey fit into this category as well, where they're only having one egg, one surviving young every few years. Another thing that can make a species vulnerable is if it's specialized. There are many ways that species can be specialized. That Galapagos tortoise, for example, they are specialized to eat specific foods and they live in specific places. The sword-billed hummingbird is one of my favorite examples. I love birds. It has the longest bill in relation to its body length of any bird. It has developed this bill in order to get nectar from a very specific passion flower. This is beneficial to the hummingbird because it doesn't have to fight with other birds to get to that food source. And this is beneficial to the passion flower because it knows that that hummingbird is going to have pollen from only that species. The two have evolved together. The problem with this, though, is if something happens to that passion flower, that hummingbird is going to struggle to survive. And if something happens to that hummingbird, that passion flower is going to struggle to survive. This specialization makes them vulnerable to extinction. The last one on our list is isolated geography. There are many species that are only found in very small places. This was one of the problems with the black-footed ferret. It only lived in one specific habitat, and that habitat became threatened. The orangutan only lives on 2 islands in Borneo and Sumatra. Those happen to be fairly volcanic islands, so even without humans, they would be vulnerable to an eruption that would happen there. Humans, however, have started cutting down their rainforests in order to make agricultural land. This is one of the arguments against palm oil plantations. So they've become quite vulnerable as their habitat is being destroyed. They don't and can't live anywhere else. They are adapted to that specific location. This is another problem with the Galapagos tortoise from our first slide. They only live in the Galapagos Islands. If something happens to them there, then they're in trouble. The dodo is an example of a species that was vulnerable, and it had many, if not all, of these vulnerable traits that we just finished talking about. The dodo only lived on the Isle of Mauritius, so it had an isolated geography. You can see where the island is on this map off the coast of Madagascar. They lived on an island with no predators, so they had lost the ability to fly. They'd become specialized to finding food in ground habitats. Specifically, there's several species of plants that relied on dodos to eat their seeds and help germinate them. And one species in particular almost went extinct if humans hadn't stepped in and started germinating their seeds for them. They also had a long maturation time and a low reproductive rate. They only laid 1 egg at a time. We're not sure exactly how long they lived or how frequently they laid eggs because we ended up killing them off pretty quickly. They were fearless of people because they lived on this predator-free island, and it was very easy for humans to grab them for food. Dodos are part of the pigeon family. Rhephis is the pigeon and dove family. And at the time, pigeons and doves were considered a very common food source. I know now we don't eat pigeon very often, we don't consider that a food source, but it used to be really super common. So travelers coming to this island would recognize this bird as a good food source. And they did. They ate a lot of them. Very few made it back to Europe, and we currently have no specimens. There's a piece of a foot and a piece of a beak in the Oxford Museum in England, but there's no full specimens of dodos. No scientist actually saw them. There's very little record of them. Because on top of humans eating them outright, we also brought with us, when we went to these islands, a lot of exotic animals. Anywhere a ship landed, they would accidentally introduce rats and cats, and they would on purpose introduce pigs and goats as future food sources. All of these animals would raid dodo nests. They nested on the ground. Why not when there's no predators? And these new predators very easily took advantage of that. So between having their eggs eaten and their humans eating them, it was a very short time that they survived after meeting us. The dodo went extinct very quickly. The dodo is just one example of a vulnerable species. that we can learn from its story and hopefully not make the same mistakes again.